Tantra Illuminated with Dr. Christopher Wallace is a journey through the depths of the human experience, as viewed through the lens of the tradition called non-dual Shiva Tantra. This multi-format podcast delves into the fascinating world of classical Tantra and its intersections with philosophy, neuroscience, psychology, human development, and the broader world of spirituality. Today's episode is a conversation, and I'm speaking with Igor Kufayev, also known as Vamadeva. He is a spiritual teacher, much influenced by non-dual Shiva Tantra, among other traditions, and he was born in Tashkent, Uzbekistan, and spent many years in London, working as an artist prior to his spiritual awakening in 2001. He's been teaching for almost 20 years and has attracted quite a devoted following. It's said that his retreats and immersions are quite powerful and intense. I haven't attended one myself, so I'm just reporting what I've heard. And he's the author of a couple of books, most notably his new book, Kundalinī. The goddess as the power of self-recognition in Tantric Shaivism. His teaching organization is called Flowing Wakefulness. This is actually the longest conversation I've ever recorded for the podcast, and we still didn't cover everything that we could have. I hope you enjoy. I'm here with Vamadeva Igor Kufayev. Welcome, Vamadeva.
It's great honor and joy to be here, Harish. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for coming on the podcast. I really look forward to this exploration. First, I'd like to mention for the listeners that the occasion for this interview, although Igor and I have heard of each other for many years, but the occasion for this interview is the publication of his new book, Kundalinī, the Goddess as the Power of Self-Recognition in Tantric Shaivism. And this is a remarkable book in many ways. We can return to it later in the conversation. But just initially, I wanted to say it serves as a much needed antidote to countless misunderstandings, popularizations, commodifications of the teaching of Kundalini. And it's really a very effective antidote. It's rooted in the primary sources of the tradition that gave us the very word Kundalini, that of non-dual Shiva Tantra, but also is deeply steeped in your direct experience of the unfolding of the process. And you exhibit great discernment in this book, and you help the reader develop more discernment as well. And what's interesting is there's an academic dimension to it, research into the primary sources, and there's also a very personal dimension to it, and there's also a poetic dimension to it. Sometimes the language is just exquisitely poetic, and one can sense, even in the invocation that comes near the beginning of the book, one can sense your own deeply personal and lived and embodied experience of relationship to the goddess, the divine power that we call Kundalini. So I'm grateful that you produced this work, which really fills a missing place in the literature. And I'm sure many others will be grateful too. So thank you.
It was a great, I would say, blessing, and nothing short of pure grace to be able to speak speak to this power, speak from the place of lived experience, understanding, integration, synthesis, when all that what is known and all that what is lived no longer can be spoken in different terms. So it's also, I would say, audacious attempt, perhaps. I am fully aware of the fallibility of us to even give it to the language. And whenever I have worked in this capacity, I always find it perplexing. And given the tradition that we share and the passion for which we share and love, that speaks of that aspect of the speech itself, of that what expresses itself, then of course it can be also seen as self-referral aspect of consciousness, recognizes itself and seeks its ways to express through us in a given moment in time. So yes, I would love to take, oh yes, that's a great achievement, but I cannot do that for all the reasons you know, perhaps even better than I do, scholarly wise. So humbly serving here in whatever capacity this could be.
Yes, it's absolutely true. Such a work only happens through the grace of the goddess, but it does flow through and take form as the understandings that you've developed through your study and your practice. That is to say, the work and the transmission couldn't exist without the flow of the goddess's grace, and yet it also needs these forms that are actualized through a human being who has undergone this process, and that's really evident in the work. And I was astonished at some points to see you saying things that I've been trying to articulate in my own teaching, and that I feel like almost nobody else is saying. So that's just delightful, right? And yeah, it's as if Kundalini is, though it's so popular as a notion, an idea, a concept, a fad, right? At the same time, the truth of Kundalini is like a hidden treasure that is ready to be known. And we see the evidence of that in the creation of a book such as this, and the fact of more people gravitating towards deeply rooted teachings and recognizing the difference between those and some flash in the pan fad version.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
I even noticed there is some kind of tendency now where those in the field almost hesitant to speak to this when disciples, followers asking, because of that very, very utter and entire over-popularization of what meant to always be spoken with tremendous degree of reverence, understanding, and caution and purpose above else. And it seems like we now reached this point where I felt personally this need to be redressed. So also one of the incentives behind this being the book is to also to radically revisit and redress this, what you have spoken also on various occasions, and including in that essay on Kundalinī, which came into my field also at a very, very auspicious time. So I think that in this regard, we definitely, I feel, have that double of the forces that add that voice of revision, reconciliation, because I don't know where it takes us otherwise, that it gets more and more people confused on the topic. Whenever there are this popularized opinion being further and further cementing the notions that ought to be melted a while ago.
Yeah, and I'd like to return a bit later to some of the very important distinctions you make in the book that clear up popular misunderstandings. But first, if you could, despite the difficulty in putting such things into language, if you could attempt to relate some form of narrative of your journey, your unfolding, which I guess began in the mid '90s, and sort of take us through with as much detail as you want the full arc of the process. Again, understanding that it's too much to try to encapsulate in a single talk, but to give us a sense of what happened to you, and perhaps mentioning how surprising or unexpected it was, or what you knew at the time, and then how you developed your understanding in tandem with this spontaneously unfolding experience. So I give you the floor for that exploration.
Sure, thank you, Harish. Well, if we are to break the sequence, perhaps we indeed could go straight to the mid '90s, which coincides with the time when, let's say, I was initiated into meditation practices proper. Prior to that, all that was just dubbing, just kind of more jostling around the spiritual traditions. I was pretty much living the life of my youthful dream of being a painter, artist, establishing myself somewhere. And at the beginning, in fact, I thought I was going to go to New York, but then the circumstances fell in such a way that I ended up in London since 1991. So I was very much in that world, in the world of art, self-expression, right? Making a living, of course, because it's always new for me. But by mid '90s, we could say push come to shove, when the accumulation of certain stresses and accumulation of certain, well, some of the events that nothing short of tragic occurred, that made me reevaluate, and with that my body begin to kind of reminding me that that I'm subjected to this like every human being. Even though I was in my prime in terms of, let's say, physicality, I was in my mid-20s, just like second half of the 20s. This is before the 30th year. I had this injury with the lower back and the third vertebra, and being very fit most of my life. Like literally, I considered myself, being very physically developed, and I always honed that side. I couldn't put socks in the morning. I couldn't do any moves. I was like incapacitated. It was very painful, and it coincided with a lot of changes in my personal life in London at the time. So I remember distinctively this, maybe what could be spoken of as that prelude, when staying temporarily in this apartment, beautiful apartment with the internal communal garden, but used by this lady who was dying in hospital, chain smoker. It was like I put the mattress in the middle of the floor so as to kind of minimize the impact of being surrounded by all the furniture and the walls, which were soaked in that nicotine. And at night, there was this thunderstorm and rain, and it was like pouring down, and I opened these French windows, fell asleep, and then suddenly in the middle of the night, I wake up with this tremendous sense in the heart of realizing that all this where I found myself is just a kind of a mental process. And of course, at that time, I didn't even have spiritual language to address it. It was simply this strong, heart-opening experience, and accompanied by the fact that there was this beautiful thunderstorm and rain and everything. And I felt, okay, well, you know what? There's nothing really that's happening in my life is really can rob me of this, what I'm actually experiencing right now. And in the following week, I had this very unusual experience when I was woken up and my body, despite that lower back crippled feeling, sprang up literally as I was still feeling like pretty much in between the states of sleep, right, and dreaming and waking. And I felt that some kind of presence whispering something into my head, at the top of my head. And I've realized there and then intuitively that this is some kind of interference that urges me to meditate. And I interpreted also that this is to ameliorate this, what I was going through physically. And I've tried by then, I would be on weekly visits to the chiropractor, and she was also meditator and really just implementing a lot of like alternative methods, not just cracking your bones. You know, she was talking to me, you know. So I received this and fell back to sleep. I woke up in the morning. I crawled to the wall, positioned myself there with cross-legged, and began meditating. So in about 2 weeks' time, all these unpleasant, painful, agonizing sensations were gone. There were a few clicks in my body in places that I didn't even expect, and that's it. So I thought, well, that's a great sign. I'm going to continue. So I continued meditating on a daily basis, following that, whatever that was, whatever that interference was. And my mother by then was already a meditator in transcendental meditation movement. And of course, she wrote me about it and the benefits of it repeatedly in the letters. And any phone call would be accompanied by attempts to convert me, to the point when I lost it. And I said, if you tell me one more time about this meditation, I'm not going to call you, my dear. Okay? My dear mother, please, I had enough. And so when this happened to me, and I kind of like again against all the odds, suddenly had this whatever that divine interference or whatever that might have been, immediately lifting off all this, let's say, what expressed itself at the level of physiology. And my mother's suddenly presence and influence became all too apparent. I've humbly had to admit that I was wrong. And not only that, when I shared it with her, she said, well, now you need to do it properly, my dear. You need to be initiated into meditation, not just by some kind of whatever that was, but by a qualified teacher. You know, she urged me to do that. So, and I agreed. And in one of my followed up visits to Uzbekistan, I went and I was initiated into just a regular TM. So from there on, my practice of meditation was ceased and I never missed a sitting. For 5 years, I was like, literally, it was, I mean, a daily routine, brushing of your teeth. It's just like, just without even, no matter where I was. And I've experienced all this, what the program was promising. All this sense of transcendence, it was very easy. And my head started to swing, instantly started to swing, just like move like this. Until there was this experience, at the time I was sharing my live with a fellow meditator and a yoga teacher. And she had a visit from another friend. Both of them were studying at Kripalu Center. You might know that Kripalu Center, which was established by Amrit Desai, Yogi Amrit Desai. So we sat down together, three of us. And in about a few minutes, like 10, 15 minutes into meditation, my body went into what I could describe as a violent spin. So intense that it freaked out the girls, the ladies, and I could not do anything about it. I couldn't stop. There was no power that I could, within myself, even though I kind of attempted, maybe I should open my eyes or do something. No, the body just took complete life of its own. And only after, maybe I don't know how long it took, I was all quite, by then realized that I have to just give in to that. And maybe if I give in to that, then that would subside. And it got even more intense. I got all into sweats. And finally, the grip was released. And I just find myself in the most exhilarating place ever. There was this sensation, the experience was literally as if I took helium or like LSD or something. And I have to add that in my teenage years, I've dabbed with quite a few consciousness-altering substances. So this was all familiar to me. This was nothing of the kind, because it combined in itself all the qualities, whilst at the very same time, what was really at that time surprised me greatly is how it was at once extremely elating, exhilarating, whilst at the very same time feeling very present. You see, inevitably I'm using language now. At the time I did not have that language, so to me it was just felt at once that I'm unraveled, let's say, in space, whilst also fully present. And the body-mind coordination was one of those movies, like if I drop some object off the kitchen top, I would catch it before it reaches the floor a few centimeters. If something is flying, I would catch a fly, and like the body-mind coordination became ridiculously sharp. This is also another thing that I have noticed. There was this extraordinary byproduct of display. So with that marked the point, of course, all this was just like a kind of intro, and the real deal took place 5 years after, in the autumn of 2001, when I went to Uzbekistan yet again to attend TM CD program, again designed by Maharishi Mahesh Yogi in the 70s and widely introduced throughout the 80s. So of course I knew about this program. Many people by then in my environment were telling me, well, this is the next thing you should do. Absolutely, you should know. But somehow I felt intuitively somewhere I knew if I go, it would be me gone. And so it came to that point in time when I actually realized that there's nothing else that matters to me other than knowing what this is all about. And of course, I'm collapsing this, condensing this all because all that was a lived drama. There was this unrequited love. There was this, extraordinary creative impulses. My career was at the very, very top. We could say, reached the point where every painter dreams of. This newly appointed director of very old gallery in London, Coleman Crane Gallery in Brompton Road. The father died, passed away, and his young son took over. And he was brought to my studio, and he instantly told me, yes, I want to take you. I want to take you to Basel. Basel Art Fair, it's like creme de la creme, top of where the artists are, like top market. top of line. It's like Basel. Same people created Miami Art Fair. It's the same. It's an offshoot. So it's like there was so much to look forward to, so much to explore. And yet, despite or in spite of that, the existential quest was so intense that I had to go and find out, literally. So if I to pause here and not to go into what happened yet and at that TMCD program, where effectively speaking, the power unleashed fully, and there was undoing of me in progressive stages for the next 6 weeks and up until my return to London, where I had this major event of which I would like to speak in a moment. But making putting a pause here, all that became clear that there was something already active in my childhood, because certain experiences, what is known as involuntary movements, have been with me quite early on, which often have been dismissed as restless leg syndrome or this or that. My mother used to sit on my shin, both of my shins as a kid, for me to fall asleep, because my body would be just kind of like propensity to, to jerk or move or even like thrown up. There was a phase, maybe 2-3 years. And I remember also distinctly that my mother had the wisdom not to follow with the suggestions of the family members to show me to a specialist. She kind of sheltered me from that, hoping maybe that this would go away, and I was the only son. So I'm deeply grateful for that, of her, that innate wisdom, because it soon kind of, when the puberty kicked in and that age of, let's say, that the teenage with this acute and almost unbearable sense of exploding sexuality came, that the energy seemed to find its outlet into the sexuality and creativity, because by then I was already an art student. And so the flow would be there. This was understood in retrospect, that the energy simply found its outlet and it's just flowing there. But my feeling that this somehow was active quite early on have been also confirmed by some astrological readings, Jyotishi, by various astrologers, including that of the legendary late Chakrapani Ulal, who was, you might know, personal astrologer of Muktananda.
Yeah.
Swami Muktananda, that is. So now, fast forwarding again to 2001, this CD program I'm in, and I will learn the sutras. The program is designed in 2 blocks. First block, learning the sutras. Then the second block is trying the sutras out on the mattresses. And these are selected sutras from the Patanjali Yoga, and culminating in what now I can reveal, because of course when we enter the program, we all sign the disclosure, but it widely known, so there's no need to kind of like pretend that somehow I'm breaking great secret. It's the lightness of the cotton wool. So it's a samyama on the lightness of the cotton wool. So the culminating sutra, there are altogether 16 sutras, with the last one culminating in the lightness of the cotton wool, which we are then prompted or spontaneously begin to hop. You might be familiar or came across of this, right? That lots of polemics have been about it. Some people are critical, some people are overly enthusiastic, but somewhere between, we could say that this was, to me and to my understanding and experience, an extraordinary program of facilitating these openings in a lot of people. And my experience, particularly in the whole area of post-Soviet Union space, because at the time it was already, Uzbekistan was independent country. I also knew people in the TM movement in Ukraine and Russia. It was phenomenal. Like 85% of the participants would have extraordinary display of movements, hopping, like so. What happened to me, though, I had to sit at the back because my chair was vibrating. I was making a lot of noise. So even on the chairs in this old rented school, the chair was just like tapping against the floor as I was sitting on it. I would have to ask the facilitator, can I just like stand maybe, because it's very difficult for me to sit. And when finally the day of trying sutras out came, my body just went off, and this experience I briefly alluded to in the book, but I've spoke about it on several occasions in my early interviews when I went openly out there to teach. But just to say, as I was about to go into this full procedure of the sutras, all this vanished. My mind became like a magma, and there was no thinking process except extraordinary physiological phenomena, somatic phenomena of as if I'm being turned inside down, nausea. It actually reminds me some of the training in the military when I was for 2 years in the Soviet Union, like some unpleasant sensations when you are in a rotating kind of like devices, and then it felt like as if I'm being trained for some space program. There was this, there was this pronounced feeling of the physiology cannot take it anymore. I don't know if I can take it. And of course, I felt tremendous internal sense of failure and shame that it came to this point. I went that far and I cannot, my body cannot do it. And at that very moment, just when I felt, okay, well, it's just I might as well just die here, literally, without exaggeration. This is not at all to paint a kind of a more dramatic picture. It felt like that. I cannot come out of this state, nor can I withstand this. At that very moment, the figure or the face of Maharishi appeared in front of me with eyes closed, and somehow reminiscing, it felt as if he kissed me in my forehead or touched my forehead. And in that very instant, an iridescent ball of snow-white light descended down, and just as it hovered above the head, my body instead was sucked into it. And at that moment, when it sucked into it, all the cells of my body exploded. Literally, I felt like as if I'm exploded into that white light. I regained mundane consciousness, lying down, like panting. And apparently all this time I was, according to the facilitator, this Indian couple, this big Indian woman, really overweight, copper, this kind of like, in her traditional sari. She was just laughing, and she was saying that she was trying to make sure I don't hit this old-fashioned radiators in the room, because it was a rented facility in the old Soviet Union school, right? Kind of like, so they had that.
So your body was bouncing around all over the place?
Totally, yeah. My body was like a ball bouncing around, and I don't remember it. All I remember, I was in that like completely dissolved state. So this was the beginning, I would say, of the process. Really the beginning, what marked the process. From there on, I've completed the program, and there was this increase in all this intensity, of course, and subtlety. I will mention a couple of experiences which were paradoxical and also at the very same time extraordinary in the sense of their, let's say, nature of how although all this is supposed to be universal, and hopefully we can also touch upon the distinction between psychic and spiritual experiences proper, because I feel there's a vast field of misunderstanding of what people often assign to experiences where they are purely psychic experiences. But one such experience was very interesting when I was already in my mother's apartment, and I was just sit down already in bed, and just to kind of like do my before going to sleep off little meditation prayer, like which I had already a habit of. As I closed my eyes, my body like literally hopped a few times up in the air, and I kind of like extended my hands because I thought I'm going to bang myself against the wall that I faced. And then body became immobile, and I felt weightlessness, and as if I'm taking flight, literally flying somewhere, not flying as a body or seeing my body flying, not those out-of-body experiences which I also had distinctively in my youth. So I already was familiar with that dislodging of between the koshas, and how, let's say, this is experienced through spatial dimension, even like seeing the body and other bodies from some kind of above space. No, this was like literally I'm flying, but not as a body, just flying. And I'm flying towards nowhere but Mount Kailash. And I even remember that it's starting to get very cold to the point that I could feel that the coldness is emanating from this eternal snow, from this snow that has been there, right? That like literally that permafrost. So, and then reaching that, I am beginning to circumambulate this Mount Kailash. And I have the aerial view of the Mount Kailash and circumambulating it in that extreme sense of like literally that, as if I feel that frost on my nose and in my skin everywhere. So when that happened, when that kind of, let's say, circumambulation completed, I returned to my seat, and in that very moment, there was this sense that something was here as a marking point, which beyond my understanding, beyond my comprehension, beyond some kind of, it's almost like archetypal forces are settling this affair among themselves. And this body simply happens to be like there was distinctive feeling as if I'm playing this in a cosmic drama, and I'm openly being shown that it doesn't matter what you are doing here. From now on, all this is being conducted by other powers, because prior to that, this was still very much, I am going through this process. It happens to me. Even no matter how intense the blissful experiences would be, there would be this, like a reference point is this individual. For example, how on earth will I live my life from now on? For example, how am I going to go back to London and start painting, right? I'm in this total mess now. So there was this reference points aplenty, whilst at the very same time, of course, enjoying and also taking into my strides whenever that, let's say, because there were some days when I would be like thwarted utterly and entirely. There were physiological phenomena which was very unusual. For example, I had almost stigmata-like on my left foot, which was not bleeding, but became enormously about size of a fist, blue, dark blue mark, as if I hit something somewhere. I've only found explanation to that later in Swami Muktananda's allusions, when in one of his talks in response to questions. He spoke about it, and he calls it, it's a bite of a snake. Literally, in the tradition, there is this being bitten by a cobra. He's responding to one young lady of Indian origin. In some of the earlier lectures, you might recall that. And I thought, oh, okay, that sounds very, very familiar, but that happened about a year from then.
Yeah, and the left foot in particular is significant, and the left big toe is often what gets bitten by the snake if you have a dream that portends something about Kundalini. So that's very
Exactly.
interesting.
Yeah. Well, because also that's the circuit as well. So clinically, the sensation of true, let's say, activation is often experienced in the legs and down in the foot, in the left foot. And it would traverse and complete itself in the right foot. This is why in the yoga tradition, the right foot of a yogi or right foot of a master, of a guru, of the preceptor, is considered to be the seat of the holiest and thou. Particularly, of course, the right, the large toe. So because it completes the cycle, the circuit, which is in an anatomical sense corresponds to left large toe to the right large toe. At that time, of course, it was all unknown to me. So going back to that experience of Mount Kailash, it also gave me reassurance and some kind of psychological strength. Somehow these fears that were prior to that very present greatly subsided. In fact, I felt this great sense of elation, this sense of something now truly magical happens, not just somatically magical, or the bliss was plenty there, of course. I was just like, even the pictures from that time, like I'm totally looking stoned, like dead stoned. Like, I mean, like seriously, like it's like, and the funny thing is with the group participants, it's like we all like, kind of like, you know, it's just like a one family of the junkies, you know, like bliss junkies in this case. So then I go back to London, and I postpone my trip like considerably, but then eventually my life is not in Tashkent, my life is in London. I have a studio I'm renting, very expensive, off Abbey Road, dream of an artist, and I have to do something, and it's like okay, so I have to make sense out of that. So I go back, and I'm thinking I'm going back there to like make sense out of this, maybe paint something, maybe I will be like, God knows, right? Maybe I'm like, will be touched by some extraordinary genius of creative self-expression, that still that sense of self somewhere, hoping that there is something for me, something for me to yeah, like all right, never mind. So that was the intent. But of course, I arrive, I go to the studio every day, and the first thing I want to do is unroll my mat. I had these futons from futon company, these Japanese futons, like stuffed with seaweed and like really good. They're not like mattresses used by TMCD, which are kind of almost promote that hopping. You know, they're quite thick. They're like about, I don't know, maybe 10, 15 inches thick. And so it's like...
But when you say hopping, you are talking about leaping fairly high in the air from lotus position. So it is still remarkable.
Yes, it is still remarkable. Absolutely. To all those skeptics, I would say it's extraordinary, because it's not done with an iota of physical exert. There's nothing that one exerts oneself to do. It comes at the point when the transcendent touches that, what now, if we are to, let's say, give a quick leap into the anatomy of the process, the conglomerate of that spaghetti junction, that most important bulbous place, Kunda, right? That bulb. When the force touches that, then temporarily the sense of gravity is loosened. With that, of course, temporarily, what's most important is the sense of identity to the physical world is loosened. Not severed, this is very important, loosened. So the somatic byproduct of that is tremendous lightness. So, of course, the genius of Patanjali is to capitalize on that so as to promote that, hence that sutra, lightness of a cotton wool, which meant to be utilized as a repeated sutra to create the samyama, right? That samyama, that togetherness, that samyama of dharana, dhyan, samadhi. So this togetherness of these limbs of yoga, which creates that final, let's say, unifying state, which in the Patanjali Sutra plays tremendously important role, because this is how a lot of things fostered, from CDs to, let's say, that final release, the Kaivalya. But for the program, Maharishi just took certain sutras and he felt this will suffice for people of our age and time to give them that direct taste. And of course, when that is experienced, it is experienced at once as an elated, blissful, and weightless state. And given one is in, let's say, in lotus, the body just naturally hops forward and upward. So, and at times, and I've observed this in our programs a lot, when the body would be just hopped up vertically, in sometimes in sequence of these hops, very, very fast. It's like literally like boom, 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 boom against the ground, and until it settles. So,
yeah. And of course, as you know, this is important also in tantric sources. We've got the 5 classic Kaula signs of mystical experience, and the second of those is Udbhava, the jump or the leap, which could be more internal or could manifest strongly externally. And as you say, that's when the energy penetrates the kunda in the low belly, and then surges up. There's this Udbhava, sometimes also called Udghata, and we even find in tantric sources that you need to have a certain number of these before you're qualified for some further teaching or transmission. And so it actually occupies a much more important place in the tantric sources than for Patanjali, where it's listed as just one of many possible samyama experiences.
yes, exactly. Very aptly brought up here. So yes, indeed, the Upava, which is the second of the 5-fold movements coming straight after Ananda, that sense, is often experienced in the context of the TMCD as one or conjoint event. So first is that elated sense, that bubbling sense of bliss, and immediately that upward movement, because obviously the force of one of the 5 pranas, the Udana, now pushes this itself up, literally that fountain-like, upward movement-like, and this is what is experienced. So just to like this kind of like expanded response, because I'm glad that you make that an important footnote both about the Upava and prior to that, because some people are very skeptical about the what's the point of all this hopping, like, isn't it all about sitting like a sphinx and just, like a rock? And the whole point here is that we need to view meditation in its multi way of how there are different meditative practices. Literally, there are meditative practices that are just to settle the mind. And that's what majority of people are introduced to, initiated to, or have experiences of. It's like that bread and butter, that really the I call it often mental hygiene, right? But then meditation progresses, of course, into a variety of ways, and that fivefold, let's say, movements, right, that are so important in the Kaula system in Tantrism, that signifies and literally gives that full sequential unfoldment. So, not sure if I can pick up the thread exactly. Well, yes, I'm back in London. I sit down. I thought, okay, I'll sit a little bit, and then I'll end up sitting 2 hours. So I sit 2 hours, and then I will be absolutely bereft of any creative impulses to do anything. I'm exhausted. I'm literally depleted, right? And I realize that all this now is serious, Harish. I realize this is not addition into my life. If I had glimpses and insights at the time when it happened, that this is an addition to my life. This is something happened and my life will become richer. At this point, I had this sudden, and I have not, and I'm not going to lie, and I'm not going to say, I will say it as I experienced it there and then. It was utterly terrifying. It was utterly terrifying to the bone, to the marrow, because I've realized that my life as I knew it is finished. Unless there is something like a plan B of running back into the forest of samsara, as Osho once declared, he used to say this in a funky way, right? People come to the cliff, right, to jump into the void. They look down and full of beans, but then, ooh, no, I better go back. So, but there was no choice for me.
Yeah, if Kundalini has truly gotten hold of you, you can't even when you try.
No, that's exactly what I want to convey here, that it's nothing to do with my being courageous, with me being this, with me being that. It's nothing to do with what I summoned up. All this is maybe felt at some point, maybe gave me that satisfaction of even tickling sense of pride. At that point, it was like literally goddess showed her face in a terrifying manner of, this is it. This is real. You better realize that the sooner you do, the better off you are. Period. I have a very short message. I don't have much time to waste. Pull your act together. Like that. So, of course.
And it's this shocking realization that your life is not about you.
Exactly. Yes, it's shocking. And I have to also add, at that time, it's not yet liberating. So if anyone thinks that, oh, yeah, that's a gamble, so just jump on that bandwagon and you are there and then freed of all the, let's say, what yet to be an arduous journey for the coming years. No, this was just that terrifying moment of realization. And of course, what happened from there on is pure science of yoga. This is where the true yoga began. This is what made me realize how beautifully, symmetrically, and congruently all this is structured. Because when I realized that terrifying moment of realizing that it's no longer what I want to do, it will do itself. And I'm here literally witnessing this process, which puts me face to face with that diplopia begins to make that move towards reconciliation of that what I've considered myself to be, the world, everything. And from that moment on, of course, that whole process of yoga began. So I would go to my studio not to paint, but to do sadhana. So this was initiation now into yet an next phase where the sittings were really the very, very core of what my day would be comprised of, and everything will be tending to that. literally tending to that, propping myself, being able to tend to myself in variety of ways. And of course, that unleashing of intuition, tremendous degree of intuition, was a blessing, because this is where later learning it is post factum showed me again, humbled at the very same time, humbling me in terms of what really is at place, what took place and what is now playing itself out. Whilst at the very same time, how integral the nature of that yoga is. From down to small little details like profuse sweating, if prior to that I had the towel next to me, because I was like, I would be like this sweat would be pouring from all my pores, like literally I would have to like dry myself up. And it's still winter, and I'm sitting with the window open in London with a naked torso, because it's no point to wear anything. Instead, I feel this sweat ought to be rubbed back into the body intensely. And it is indeed part of what is the curriculum of yoga procedure, because this sweat is extremely, extremely rich in minerals. It's rich in minerals, and it's rich in all this, what sustains the body at the time. And of course, we can touch upon here a lot of aspects of the body becomes this kind of self-contained biological lab, down to what to eat, when to eat, what to do, what not to do, all on a level of pure intuition. Like, for instance, I went through a phase when I could not have any solids because there was so much pranayama. And because of that, there's spontaneous pranayamas, various kinds, my body begins to glow, literally like glowing, like the skin glowing, like as if I applied some kind of serum. And of course, I lost a lot of weight. Like literally, I became this, like, but not emaciated, just lean, really lean, and not like all the fat was melted. And yet I didn't want to eat food. So I went to a great length finding the best milk I could possibly find. There was this organic farmer that would sell their milk in one of the organic shops and where I lived at the time. So I will buy that milk. I will make my own ghee as well. And so that's what I will have. I will have a bowl of milk with a big dollop of ghee, spices, turmeric, cardamom, all that. And it went for at least a couple of months. And I didn't feel at all any kind of lack of energy, or so the body began to communicate at that level all this information.
Yeah.
You see,
And can I just clarify for the listeners who haven't experienced this? It's almost impossible to convey how much it is the case that the energy is running the show completely. Like you used the phrase a minute ago, I didn't want to eat food, but I understood, of course, this is nothing to do with preference. It's nothing to do with, oh, I've heard fasting is good, I'll try that at all. It's like the energy is running the show, and you have to obey, as it were. Like it demands the sustenance it needs, and it rejects what it doesn't need. And all you can do is come into alignment with this unfolding process of immense power, and the mind is not an agent anymore. It's not calling the shots, and it's so just to try to make that even more clear, because I know what you mean, but some people are
yes,
not going to be imagining it right.
totally. And it's interesting also because this, what let's say before was considered to be as flashes of intuition, there and then became the really way of life, because the mind was like a mush up thing. Like I could not at some point focus on anything. Like I literally walked with small block notes, like this pocket size, and a pencil, a pen, to write what I need to remember. If I go out, for example, if I find that I need something, I would not remember it when I'm out. My mind will be potentially could blank out. So everything was this little memos, little memories, a little like, okay, this, I need this, I need to get this item, I need to get that item. Okay, so I didn't even want to strain my memory. And in any case, the mind would be in this place of suspense. And intuition, in fact, would really, really run the show. I would even say down to, for example, practical aspects, because the question of now I'm not painting and I'm not even showing my work, I'm not even doing anything, right? I had these investments, and there's one particular investment that a lot of like people who I knew were telling me to sit on. And suddenly I had this flash in meditation, exact instruction what to do about it. And okay, like I do exactly that. And suddenly I'm making 5 times of like, I don't know, just like a random example, it gives me financial security suddenly to do what I need to do without even having to worry about it. So this intuition was literally taking care of a lot of aspects. It was all encompassing. So it's not like I'm becoming a mendicant suddenly by following up, let's say. So in other words, this is where gives me the audacity today and the reassurance when people ask, how, like, I want to know things will pan out itself well. I can surrender, but if I surrender, does it mean I will end up on the street? It's very hard to explain that this is not how it works. It has this, the true surrender, if it's a true surrender, makes one completely and utterly in flow of everything.
Yeah.
Whereas anything that is bargain-like or a deal-like or negotiation-like only reinforces that separateness where we feel as if we are to apply tremendous effort. And that's, of course, for spiritually aligned people or people who go through these phases of sadhana, can become a real dilemma. What do I do now? What do I tend to? So the understanding that all this is so intricately interconnected. And there are terms in Sanskrit, right? Like just like there's special potency, right? That unexplainable, like in Ayurveda, certain herbs have potency that are beyond their what otherwise compositional structure of how it impacts, let's say, the doshas. It's known like as prabhav, special potency, like turmeric has prabhav. So it exceeds the properties of what it actually meant to ameliorate, depending on how one uses it. Yeah. And in a spiritual sense, there is this term pratibha, right? It's the increase of insight into the essence of what needs to be done in any given moment in time.
Yep.
So that pratibha, of course, begins to shine in its own light, because maybe before it was dimmed, because the incessant activity of the mind, of course, somehow outshines it, even though that sounds like an oxymoron, but we tend to feel that we ought to follow that what feels more congruent with the thought process, what is logical, what is rational. But pratibha has nothing to do with rationale. It sometimes can present us with paradoxes and of irreconcilable nature, only to prove us being wrong in the given moment in time in terms of what we were unable to give our trust into. And this, of course, is both humbling and empowering at the very same time.
Well, what's bizarre is it's super intelligent. It's completely non-rational, and yet it's super intelligent. It shines with this unerring accuracy. and shows exactly where to move and which step to take next or what is needed. And it knows without being a mind, without being rationality in any way. It's extraordinary.
Exactly. And this is something that I think, if we are to speak about it in terms of, let's say, cultural prevalences and tendencies, where we find ourselves in our given epoch, in our given civilizational, let's say, alliances, is where the mind is given all its, let's say, importance, whilst this aspect is somehow only in certain pockets survived, let's say, that otherwise what came with the age of rationale, right, with that age of reason, so-called age of reason, right, that the trust into what provided that extraordinary, also extraordinary, no doubt, and display in terms of technological breakthroughs. So for spiritually aligned and for the sadhaka, this is to be cultivated, certainly to be invoked and trusted into. And that's what my life became very much for the ensuing years. And I would say what gave me there and then that needed, let's say, sense, what otherwise, okay, so everything is taken now. I cannot live my life the way I thought the life meant to be lived. So, but I would say that a line, right? In non-existence of myself, I found all existence, as Rumi is often cited. So it is like that paradoxical exchange, that quicksilver-like, where that what is melting away as that sense of self that superimposed nothing else onto the self gives way, then what shines is nothing short of what always have illumined everything from behind the scenes. But now it is illumined, and one is the knower of that. One is no longer, let's say, eclipsed by this, even if it is traditionally, let's say, if we are to give this firmly rooted understanding, right, of the true sense of egoity, right, as it is in the Trika, in Pratyabhijñā, and how it is really truly understood, so that ego is never really a problem. The dance here is subtle, that movement is subtle here, that subject-object relationship, the pure subjectivity and the objective sphere of experience here are mutual and interchangeable because they are one and the same awareness, but simply displayed in its modalities where that is required for experience. And this is what, to me, is very interesting, that the phase of that unfoldment from, let's say, this, what was based on the process, gradually began to, I would say, stabilize. And so there was much less to write home about. There would be much less of the phenomena. And everything is now being experienced deeply internally. That what I often refer in my own work as the phase of refinement of perception, where the templates are being accessed in the meditation, where the literally access to the tattvas, where all this what embeds the senses with the power and what recognizes in this world of objective phenomena gains its provenance, begins to be experienced internally without the aid for an external object. So all the internal sounds, the world of sounds, the myriad of sounds, the world of sense, of all the different sense, the world of that, let's say, what is translated here as divine touch or sparsha, that what is experienced as this very, very infinitesimally subtle sense of internal, let's say, vibration. So, and that, of course, was one of the most potentially beautiful, not dramatic, not at all in any way that one can really convey in a much more pictorial sense, because how can one describe, let's say, the myriad of sense of the rose when you sit in your own room away from any actual presence of the rose flower? And this is really, really tapping into that world.
And it's very difficult to describe how rich experience becomes. I mean, from an observer's perspective, you're just sitting in an almost empty room on a futon, right? But the inner experience becomes indescribably rich and varied and detailed and nuanced and subtle. And I would say at this stage, you also experience this enormous fluidity where the boundary between inner and outer becomes, at the very least, porous. And would you agree?
Yes, absolutely. And I would say that also this had, again, phases, distinctive phases. One phase, or the phase of, let's say, these internal experiences drew a certain veil over the world of objective phenomena. I would say at times a literal veil. So like when you go outside and you walk around, as I also like developed this habit of just sort of roaming around, like sometimes the body, after maybe so much sitting, it needs this movement. So I would just take on and just go somewhere for a walk. Well, there's no purpose. There's no need for me to go here or there. And I will find myself like some miles away from where I was. Okay, let's just recalibrate. Where am I? Where did I? Okay, so, okay, I see. Let's go back. And everything is kind of like slightly as if underwater. This is what I mean, like veiled reality. That because of the richness of that internal world of experience. But then, of course, what's interesting is that as these experiences progressed, I remember this marked point when suddenly the smallest things began to be noticed in an extraordinarily sharp, magnified way. Like suddenly, just something as simple as this large conker trees in Primrose Hill, I remember, where these garlands that come out of them before the leaves come out. You know, like the buds, then the buds break, and I remember standing under the tree and just looking at these things as if I've never seen it before, as if I'm beholding this as an extraterrestrial, some kind of earthly phenomena. And it would be in these minute little things, something that attention to this would be, and I've spoke about it before, and I know for some it may sound like pathetic, but I remember seeing a spider in a shower room, broke me down emotionally. Just like spider there in the shower, like whilst I was like showering, just put me in touch with something I can't explain. It was just like this little alive thing here, just like crawling here. So this began that heralded that opening. You see, that opening where that distinction between the internal experiences and the marvel of the external world is began to get obliterated. And of course, it most likely was shown, at least in my experience, through small things, not through grandiose things. Because maybe if I was in the Himalayas, or maybe if I was in a desert, it would have been this grandeur of nature. I was in London, right? So it was like,
I know what you mean, though, but because those small things, that tiny sprout coming out of the bud or the spider, those small things become. It's hard to describe, but it's a revelation, right? It's a revelation of the miraculousness of existence, and it's almost as if this, even though this is a small thing, it contains and implies something far more than just what is visible. Was that your experience?
well, maybe when that was as an afterthought. But if I, to be honest, it was more on that kind of emotional maybe level, you see, like
Yeah.
that emotional connection to it. So it kind of felt at some point, maybe again now I know the language. You see, that's the problem. The problem is that I'm now trying to step into how it felt at the time
Mm.
when I did not have the language. Now I have the language, so it's tapping into the richness of these various rasas. If I had to give it a retrospective now overview. So one experience could maybe invoke that rasa, rasa of like love, connection, eroticism, that amorous sense.
Mm.
Another is more of the humility, that piety, right? That kind of compassion. You see that like the fragile life of a spider who, like, if I don't like spiders, he'll be smashed. He, like, spider is here. It's not his domain. Like, he'll be washed down the, black hole. Like, it was that rasa. You see that? And at other times, there would be a rasa of valor, right? I remember like this, for example, I would feel extremely courageous for no real apparent reason. I would feel just like feeling, right, yeah, I can just ride a horse somewhere, like, this was this kind of almost re-entering the context of human experience, but coming out from somewhere where that literally is re-entering. Because I don't want to underestimate how profoundly severing that was in the, let's say, that phase of the sadhana, how things were literally at some point had to gain that sense that this material existence, this world, doesn't really matter. I had to really know that to give myself to sadhana, not on intellectual level that I'm going to gain something from it. It had to be a lived experience of value that coming from a true evaluation of that, and it cannot be falsified, it cannot be forced, it cannot be intellectually imposed. So, and now re-entering that, of course, I could say also kind of began to give these jewels of insights of what actually human being might be. See?
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, I totally get what you mean about the rasas, and there's also almost like a psychedelic quality that is present at this stage, right? Because you're utterly captivated. The little thing is fascinating. It's a whole world unto itself. Uh, Now, but to move on from that, what was the was there? How would you describe the rest of this particular arc? And are you someone who would say that there is there's a definitive conclusion to this process, even though, of course, consciousness is ever unfolding more of itself, and awakening can go ever deeper. But what was the rest of this arc for you, and did it come to a sort of culmination in some way.
All right. So, well, first, maybe what's important here is that at that very time, I also developed ferocious appetite for knowledge. Literally, that comparison, knowledge as food. So, like, literally, if you don't feed yourself, you go hungry. You become famished. Like, literally, that this was not just, oh, I'm curious about it. Oh, I kind of find out now. No, it was again propelled by this same sense of intuition. I would go to this largest bookstore in London on Shaftesbury Avenue, Watkins, which has been there for a couple of centuries, and spend hours on end looking for the right book. And of course, they had tremendous, always collection of books. I would just sit there and literally read excerpts from the books before I would purchase something. This is how the play of consciousness of Muktananda fell into my laps, literally, not metaphorically. It actually fell on my shoulder from the book shelf as I was pulling something else. And it was a funny encounter. At the very same time, there was this chap who was telling me, like, he probably somehow sussed it out. Somehow, I don't know how. Like, you're going through something, aren't you? And, well, it's not unusual that in that particular shop you would encounter this kind of, because, it's known for, right? So he just goes, okay, I think you need to see this lady. And he gives me this Indian spiritual teacher. She's like with a huge tilak on her forehead. And he gives me like her book, and she tells she's the one, she's a master of Shaktipat. This is what you need now, man. Like, this is really definitely. I look at her picture, and nothing in me moves there, So I thank him. I put it down, and as I was like reaching out, this book falls out. I grab it here, and it's Muktananda's Play of Consciousness. And I looked at Mukta and that small face there, right, that inserted in the backdrop of the ocean, this edition with the kind of a golden and color. I'm sure you know I'm talking about. It's on my shelf here.
Yes,
Along with Muktananda's portrait and Maharishi there. And I looked at this, and my body begins to vibrate at the subtlest level. I feel like I feel that literally as if I'm holding something extraordinarily precious. So this is how this phase also coincided with a very quick, rapid introduction into creme de la creme of spiritual teaching, because I came back for the next book by Muktananda, and by then, of course, Secret of the Siddhas, and you can see that there's now this Muktananda towards the end of his life actually teaching completely something else, not these early talks, not this sort of like a potpourri of yoga and Advaita Vedanta, but like just really goes into this Kashmir Shaivism.
Yeah.
Oh wow, this excitement is like cannot contain. It's 2002, 2003, and I'm hoarding these books. I'm like I cannot get enough. And of course, what really was interesting, striking, and extraordinary, if I now to respond to what you've asked, is as I'm reading the essence of the teaching, I begin to feel as if this is what I have always been. So it's not like something that, and before that I dubbed into quite various different teachings. There was no need to talk about this, but there was a great interest in Buddhism. And I always admired that kind of like even the figure of a Buddha was always like, and a level of feeling. Christ's story has always been very, very strong as well in, not Christianity, but literally that Christ, that even as a painter, a certain, let's say, something was very, very, very moving, deeply moving. Of course, being born in Uzbekistan, Sufi. But there is something about the expositions and the emphasis that made me feel literally this is really how I here understand life. And more so, this may sound a bit self-complimentary or what have you. It felt as if this is the teaching by which I lived already without knowing it. It had that strong sense of all-embracing quality. And of course, being a painter, that aspect, once I touched this, let's say some of this, at that time, just like nuggets of Abhinavagupta's, right, glosses on the Natya Shastra of, this was like a revelation of a lifetime. There was nothing in the world of esoterics, nothing in any philosophy that could come close in terms of how it all sits together. So of course, sharing it with you is preaching to a choir, kind of. So this realization, of course, is where it's not going to be possible for me to say this, of where these personal realizations and recognition of the value of the teaching begins and ends. I have to be very honest about this, because it's like the philosophy itself already has such an extraordinary completeness to it that, of course, now that I, at some point when I came out, let's say, and made it a conscious act, you would probably like to know, and when I first was invited to the Science and Non-Duality, I already made it my business to bring at least some of the basic tenets of Tripartite from get-going, from the very first time when Ricardo invited me to take part on the panel in 2012. We were still based in Costa Rica, because the original guy, Timothy Conway, who was a TM, got sick, and together with John Hagelin, who was at the time leader of the TM movement in the United States, and Mark McHugh, one of the TM teachers from Vancouver, monitored by Ricardo and myself. So the four of us on the stage and the three of us as the panel. I thought, well, we had very little time to prepare for it. And Rick invited me and then broke it down that, well, this is how Timothy Conway envisioned the panel. We already had it all worked out. Like, just chime in, just join in. And I'm like, I'm sorry, if I'm here, I cannot do that. It has to resonate within. And in a bizarre way, this whole, let's say, the very, very, the very basic tenets, the seeing and seeing, right? That like I thought, let's just start with that. Let's start the panel. And John Hagelin really liked that, because to him it was very close to the Samhita of Rishi Devata Chandas, the Vedic curriculum, which Maharishi Mahesh Yogi taught. So it was like very, very like a smooth transit, and we were true to the original intent of that panel, which was already in the program anyway, whilst at the very same time speaking to this from that angle which I myself brought. And Kashmir Shaivism at that time, Harish, was still a novelty. It was still like, there was no, like, for example, well, I don't want to go into this kind of like, this is more like doesn't matter, but it was still a novelty. But in a matter of the following 3-4 years, there was this explosion. You probably remember that, right? Like by the year 2015, 2016, like I could see that people started adding, right, Kashmir Shaivism to their curriculum, to their biographies a lot. for all the reasons. Some of these reasons were justified. At other times, it's just simply felt that, okay, so this is a new fad. This is becoming fashionable. Of course, that I've realized much later how important to draw the distinction, because so many people, I will just tell you, just between us, if we were just jumped on a bandwagon because it felt like, oh, that's great, philosophy to indulge, finally, like, like somehow it was just totally taking the wrong end of what this is about. But as that kind of prolonged maybe response to, I would say that it will be hard for me to distinguish realizations from what the teaching communicates. So therefore, I would humbly consider myself someone who simply taps into the flow of that, right, of that river of tradition.
Yeah, and I think it's important to acknowledge that this spontaneously unfolding Kundalini process, which is so all-encompassing, which is energetic and physical and psychic and everything, right? It has an innate intelligence to it, and the process doesn't equally align with all the traditions in the world, right? It aligns with some better than others, and so it's no surprise that it aligns extremely well with Tantric Shaivism, which is the tradition that coined the term Kundalini, right? And that was the first to articulate about it in such detail and depth. And just for the listeners, this book you mentioned, Secret of the Siddhas, that's the one where Swami Muktananda is going most deeply into Tantric Shaivism. And of course, he himself had a spontaneously unfolding 9-year-long Kundalini process, not dissimilar from yours. So what's extraordinary, though, is that intuitive power, that pratibha, somehow knows that. Here's the book. I'm dropping it on your shoulder. It's inexplicable and mysterious, but it gives us that beautiful sense of wonder at the mysterious workings of the pattern, which has this innate intelligence in it somehow.
Yes, absolutely. And to maybe just to give it, like, if I were to push to, like, what was that arc? So the arc here was that this all really is becoming fully human. So in other words, human being here is not a skin to discard.
Right.
It's not the shell. Once we realize the kernel, that to be discarded. This is not an analogy of an almond. But paradoxically, that what contains, the very container here is as precious. And that's what the beauty to me of that what communicated in so many ways, in so many extraordinary ways, because after all, Trika Shaivism has these various doctrines and they're not all the same. The Spanda has one emphasis and Pratyabhijñā another, and Krama yet another. The beauty of this is that mutual recognition of the value of human life, which to me became so clearly the message in the vacuum of ideology that we find ourselves, including within the, I would say, most spiritually, let's say, aligned communities, where that human aspect is discarded, repeatedly has been discarded as this, under this pretext, is discarded, sidetracked, meant to be seen through, meant to be literally devalued, whereas here it is celebrated for all the right reasons, to which we yet collectively, truly come close to appreciate fully. So in other words, the drama of being a human, this embodiment, is now we could see in our given day and age gains its importance more than ever, perhaps, because we're now fully faced with the limitations of how this or that religion tries to solve this human condition and human drama in the light of, let's say, where we find ourselves, which also cannot be seen independently from how consciousness expresses itself, obviously.
Yeah, beautiful. So would you say that the ultimate fruit of real Kundalini awakening is the ability to live fully human? I don't know exactly how to say it, because there's two elements, right? We experience the depth of our nature, we experience the transcendent absolute, but then somehow the process arcs toward this incredibly simple and yet beautiful and miraculous thing of living fully human, which of course the vast majority of humans aren't, because they're living inside their identity constructs, they're living in their mind world. And that's why the Kundalini process has to deconstruct the identity utterly, right? And totally obliterate all the mental constructs about meaning, because those are actual obstacles to being fully alive, to allowing the divinity to become its full humanity. Would you agree with that, or how would you say it?
Yes, I could sign up for that. I can sign up under that. I would just add that the very dynamic creative tension here, let's say, between what is exemplified here as Shiva expresses itself or himself, so that this universe of forms and phenomena becomes the possibility of knowing itself, is mutually inseparable. And the most extraordinary aspect that it's not, in as far as my understanding goes, there is no point where we can speak of something prior to, in a sense of what awareness here represents in its relation to self-awareness. So that creative tension is experienced everywhere, at every strata of creation. And what particularly I find extremely seductive in the teaching, which culminates in the unparalleled insights, depth, and nuances and intricacy in Abhinavagupta, is that element of chamatkara, the astonishment, the aesthetic delight that is here literally a simultaneous experience of that what is transcendent and immanent, where they juxtapose, overlap, and give rise to everything, and into which one subsides and dissolves utterly and entirely. So this, to me, is one of the most, I would say, forbidden territories. But of course, it is forbidden because one can imagine this ad infinitum of how that might be. So therefore, the becoming here of that what we already are at a given is also part and parcel of what we are. So if we are to speak about it in individual terms, and if we are to speak about it in collective terms, this is also potentially what is given as a possibility to humanity at large. And we know that in various cultures throughout, not just in India per se, this hidden power is what has always been seen as that mediator, that even if it's sound dualistic, the mediator between the world of divine and the world of incarnated. The mediator between that, what either monoistically spoken of the Godhead, or polyistically in terms of the various divinities and its aspects. At this point, it doesn't matter. And that, let's say, world of us here and who we are, because it is in us that this is settled. So to me, this also, where arc doesn't close, but rather continues. It's a continued process of progressive degree of realization in the sense of fuller and fuller and fuller embodiment of
Yes.
into that what we are as a potentiality. You see, so this is where I'm kind of almost reluctant to ever put a full stop.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. There's no full stop, but if we conceptualize the journey of Kundalini in this oversimplified manner as a movement in the body, as you note in your book, in Tantric Shaivism, the teaching better matches what you experienced, which is we don't have Kundalini starting at the base, usually starting at the heart, often then descending to the base, and then rising all the way up to the crown, and then coming back to the heart as her home, but in a new way, seeing the place as if for the first time, right? Because having traversed the entire central channel, which is also of course, the axis of the universe, then the return to the heart in an integrated way. Like, of course, that's not an end per se, but if we narrativize the process, right, then it's in a way an important point of integration from which it can theoretically go ever deeper. Would you agree with that?
Yes, but only ontologically, and maybe it will be helpful if we give examples here to illustrate. There are certain similarities in the teachings of the, let's say, greatest apostles of Advaita Vedanta, exemplified in Ramana Maharshi, who also emphasized the descent as the final phase, where Kundalini, literally according to Ramana, dies in the heart as it descends down through Amrita Nadi.
Yeah.
And in the teachings of Ramana Maharshi, at least in his day job as a proponent of Advaita Vedanta, this makes perfect sense, because that's where the individuality fully dies. In other words, Kundalini as Atma dies in that chamber where it is merged not just in the Sahasrara, but it re-emerges from where it emerged, we could say.
Yeah.
Whereas if I understand this in my own experience, in how this is expounded by the Shaiva masters, the goal is not for the death of the individual, but rather in that what is exemplified by that creative tension between Shiva and Nara, where Nara is nothing other than Shiva in its expressive potentiality to know itself as this pinpoint, as a vantage point, which is necessary for infinity to be known. Otherwise, infinity cannot be known. It can only be known through its utter and entire opposite. And it is within that complete and utter confinement, we could say, the freedom is tasted over and over and over. To me, this is where the emphasis of the Shaivite masters is placed. And to me also, this is why there are certain dialogues diverge among those who, let's say, keep to the Advaita Vedanta perspective, which, effectively speaking, still left the world as irreconcilable phenomena, because that world is unreal, only Brahman is real, Brahman is the world, has never been reconciled.
Right.
And it has been, the answer is left hanging. And so that answer here gives the variables, and one of them is that the Maya, as this manifestation, is illusion. Even if we don't speak about it as a mirage, it's still illusion, it's appearance in Brahman. Whereas in the understanding, in the tantric understanding, Maya is Shakti. So she's as real as could possibly be.
Yes.
As real as it gets. So therefore the cessation of individuality is not even required. What it's required is a complete remake or a transformation, seeing it for what it is. And of course, there are degrees, and one could speak about it. There are many different ways of how can one arrive. But in the process, of course, it is analogous to how it is seen by, let's say, Ramana Maharshi, and how it is expounded by the Trikashaiva masters, in a sense of having to traverse that journey of withdrawal, progressive withdrawal and absorption, so as to then reclaim. And it's interesting that in the book I took the liberty to ponder on variety of ways, because in some of the masters have positioned Kundalini lower down into the Kanda, into Nabi, more closer to Nabi, which corresponds to the, well, it's in the yogic context, is a Manipura, right?
Yes, in the Shaiva sources, Kanda is distinct from Manipura because it's lower. It's between Swadhisthana and Manipura.
Yes.
Yeah,
but it's still considered to be in the domain of Nabi chakra.
The belly region, yeah.
The belly region, yes. So in earlier sources, the Kundalini is coiled, as it were, in the heart. But then it seems to be lowered down, descended down. And so the
from a historical perspective, yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And then with the Hatha Yoga, it's been moved even more down into the seat, into Muladhara, which we know in the Trikashaivism has a different model and different experience experientially as well. I can speak from my own experiences and from those who have reported, right, the clinically how it is experienced. So my suggestion was simply, as I said, that part about the liberty is that there is a possibility that we experiencing a progressive, let's say, identification with the material, let's say, in the overall sense. So this is why awakening is taking place more often, not from the heart region, but lower down. So in other words, as our consciousness had been pushed, moved down in that universal order of manifestation.
Yeah. Let me make even more explicit what you're saying, because I think this is a very interesting hypothesis, that in our very early sources, we tend to find Kundalini's home is in the heart, as you said. And then in progressively later sources, we find her located as her default location further down, and then even further down over a span of many centuries. And that you're saying that this could possibly indicate that humanity as a whole, has to arrive to the base of coming fully into materiality. Before then, there can be the complete ascent, which integrates materiality with the ineffable or the absolute. Is that right?
More or less, yes, more or less. So whether this is necessary price, whether this is a byproduct of that, let's say, epoch we live in, right? Whether this is the byproduct of overall, let's say, sluggishness, if we put it, or some kind of lapse in consciousness per se of how it is experienced throughout the human neurophysiology. But at the very same time, this also, of course, again, based on clinical based observations, it seems that that model fashioned by the Pratyabhijñā and the Shatchakra Nirupana, that classical model, which is adopted into the curriculum of a new age one way or another anyway,
Yeah.
Is where a lot of people experience this, with rare exceptions where there is already certain refinement, where the heart is a driving force. So this, we could say that, like, I have personally encountered a lot of people for whom awakening became a complete and utter nuisance, that they would rather be better off, and their request or their the greatest desire is to go back to status quo. And the experience is literally that like the somatically soul experience down there, sort of the driving force of feeling, emotive resonance is not there. So it's an interesting observation, simply as a maybe side note, which,
well, maybe it's a very important one. In fact, so there's so much more we could cover, and I want to turn to a few topics in the book. But in terms of what you just said, as you know, and very few people know, the tradition of Tantric Shaivism teaches three forms, or three aspects, I should say, of Kundalini. And in terms of their sort of quasi-metaphorical locations in the body, we've got Para-Kundalini in the crown and above the crown, and Shakti Kundalini in the heart, and prāṇa-Kundalini in the Kunda, near the base. And so this Shakti Kundalini in the heart gets special attention as the starting point of the process, at least in one of the major models of understanding. You highlight that in the book, which I love. And it's never explicitly stated in the primary sources, but it seems to me that ultimately, these three different aspects of Kundalini become one, like they merge with each other. And I don't know if you would agree with that, but I do think that this aspect of her balanced between the worldly, the embodied, and the transcendent and absolute at the level of the heart is extremely crucial to the tantric tradition, at least, and certainly for some of our experiences as well.
yes, true. Well, I am reluctant a little bit to use this juxtaposition superimposed on human anatomy purely because of limitations this poses, and these limitations largely because we tend to take things literally.
Yeah,
we tend to take things literally to the point of how Kundalini is viewed as if traveling inside human body in many models. And
Right.
for that reason, there was a conscious decision not to illustrate book with any diagrams. Because at some point I've been asked, as an artist by training, wouldn't it be wonderful to have some drawings, some diagrams? And I sat with this idea, and I decided that this is not what I would like here to really be communicated. And I'm very both pleased and humbled. And yes, I would say feel satisfied that you have picked the poetic aspect. Because to me, it's more important that the book communicates something at the vibratory level rather than pictorial level, despite all my background as a visual artist. So something that is more picked at the level of cadence, rhythm, frequency, meter, rather than at the level of, let's say, pictorial representation, which is always immediately solidifies and tends to have this, well, one-sided understanding, because when we say the head or the crown, the heart, the base, superimposed on anatomy, we begin to view this process in strictly anatomical sense of its correspondence, whereas the head or the crown can be spoken of as abode of, let's say, as heavenly abode.
Yes.
Literally, right?
Yeah.
The lower chakras as the manifestation, the realm of manifestation. So to me, the model of manifestation itself, the model of the tattvas, is more applicable. So in other words, realm of pure awareness or pure realm, the psychic realm, and the manifested physical realm. Here, physical also taken with a pinch of salt, because physical in the sense of what and how universe is made. So this, let's say, if we are to speak about that, then of course we speak of the anthropomorphic body. We speak about here the cosmic body. If we are to speak of the cosmic body, then yes, this would be the way that three-in-one nature of Kundalini, para, Shakti or Chit Kundalini, and Prana Kundalini. And what also felt for me very important to emphasize and make it accessible to the reader, because it also has this impetus and incentive to make the book not just as a manual or redressing certain things, but I'm fully aware how many people who have been struggling with, let's say, whatever level of their own awakening would be reading this book. So it also, may I suggest, carries the aspects of appeasing. So in other words, like literally healing, so that a mere being exposed to these words and sentences and passages would somehow hopefully affect one's status by bringing the necessary reconfirmation, reassurance, along with understanding, and altogether make this all really worthwhile, rather than just picking certain emphasis on just this aspect or that aspect.
Yeah. Yeah.
So one of this was the scintillating quality of Chit or Shakti Kundalini, of that propensity for transcendence and for eminence, the transcendence and manifestation, how that is decided at that level. Literally, wherever the tendency, if the tendency towards transcendence prevails, in other words, in language of the Tantrikas, if Shiva Shakti are undisturbed in the embrace, they are remaining in that universal cosmic, let's say, coitus. They are in that state where nothing is required. But if Shakti glances anywhere momentarily, immediately the curiosity arises, as naturally would be then, we know that would be naturally explainable why we have that. Then with a tremendous force, manifestation is carried out. So then prāṇa-Shakti takes over. And that role of Shakti Kundalini here as that intermediary and that scintillating, where that possibility for either to merge back into what could be spoken of as in some other traditions, as Para-Brahman, right, or Paramashiva, where Shiva Shaktis are indistinguishable. So there, in other words, the power and the source are absolutely indistinguishable.
Right.
But the slightest, ever so slightest move towards, as a propensity, as a curiosity, where the potentiality can take, creates the cascading effect of manifestation, where prāṇa-Kundalini takes over there and then, and in other words, it's not even taking over. It is prāṇa-Kundalini, because from there on, prāṇa-Kundalini is that what creates everything.
Yeah. Yes. Jagat Yoni, she's called, the source of the world, especially the world of life. So I want to highlight something you said and you've written in the book, which is, I think, absolutely brilliant, absolutely crucial to add to the discourse on these subjects. And so, for example, pages 114 to 116, you address this, and in other places too, this misunderstanding of Kundalini being inside the body. And there's this beautiful sentence you have here. Ramana Maharshi said, "We speak of Kundalini in terms of within only because of our identification with the body. In truth, she is neither within nor without, or perhaps more accurately, we are within Kundalini. This experience of being human is the very result of consciousness curled in on itself." So that's beautifully stated. And I think it's absolutely right that if somebody misunderstands Kundalini as being within the body, then, it's a way, just that very misunderstanding can sometimes slightly dampen the process, or be some kind of a hindrance. And so this is one of the things I love most about the book, is that you are really dispelling or antidoting this problem of literalism, people taking these metaphorical descriptions literally, which 1,000 years ago they didn't. They weren't literalists. They didn't have the same problem, So that Kundalini doesn't exist at some specific location in the body. It's more a discussion about where we experience her movements somatically, and where they seem to arise from or merge back into. And I completely agree with what you said about the problem of localizing the three aspects in the body. And indeed, that's why when we explore the reality of embodiment, we have to experience that the base of the body is earth, right? And the crown is heavenly realms. And the reason the heart is so crucial, I would say, is it's that meeting point. It's like where earth and heaven meet. That's where the divine incarnates as human, and that's the heart. Does that accord with your view or experience?
Beautiful. Yeah, that's very much. It's like I'm hearing it back. It's very, that heart is the Christian Vesica Pisces, the overlapping of two circles that create that fish-like shape. That literally the overlapping here is not just overlapping per se, but the overlapping is the balancing. This is where literally the heaven and earth are balanced at.
Yes.
So, and therefore human being here as the guardian, right, that placed in the Garden of Eden, it is a very beautiful religious or metaphysical view of the reality and the true status of a human being, where we at once are humbled by a real meaning of who we are, whilst at the very same time given the tremendous sense of responsibility that we carry, because we are not just puny little things that here somehow being pushed around, but we, and literally by virtue of our existence, is the possibility given where that, let's say, what can always go out of whack, out of rhythm, is reconciled. So this, we could also find allusions to that in so many various different cultures. And it is very beautiful, of course, in the sense of how Tantra views this, because the positivistic view of the teachings of Rahasaya, that in itself is that all-embracing, things are put together and given a fusion, a given literally that equal viewing, equal sensing, equal tasting, for the purpose of literally, if we are to now speak about the what here in metaphysical sense distinguishes us from the rest of creation, is that what has the capacity to balance and restore. So this is not a just some kind of existential affair of existential philosophy of like circumambulating one's belly about one's purpose in life or lack of thereof. But it's repositioning ourselves at once, reminding of ourselves of our true status, which comes with responsibility, and at the same time, where the beauty of it all. So this, yes, it's, yeah, I don't know what else
Yeah,
can be
no,
added to the.
no, that's perfect. And I wanted to read a very powerful sentence from the book, because I think this perfectly summarizes like the whole journey of Kundalini. Not that it has a full stop, once again, but you say here, it is as though the Shakti, the power, appeases an innate aesthetic sensibility by undergoing a self-immolating transfiguration, mirrored in turn by a grace-bestowing, self-beatifying metamorphosis. And it seems to me that's one of the most important sentences in the book, because that's just, in one sentence, encapsulating this whole incredible movement. And it seems to describe your personal journey as well.
And this also echoes that very, we could say, grand ethos of Indic civilization, where that act of sacrifice, which is so important to the people of Indian subcontinent, through the dismembering of Prajapati, who literally sacrifices that oneness, that unity, so that diversity, multiplicity can take.
Yeah.
And that act lays the sediment to all the longing that we all experience, because we are the echo of that original sacrifice. And it is through us that sacrifice meant to be carried back to the original unity to restore it. So the very meaning of yagya, the very meaning of that sacrificial offering, when taken outside of this understanding, becomes just a ritual bereft of a true measure of what it carries. So this was my attempt to put it in the language of that, what it's self-immolating. And in that rediscovery, be self-beatifying, because this is literally how it is being experienced, and how I see this, how it echoes that very, very Indian ethos of sacrifice, and what we all are, like indebted to that. In a way, this experience, this individual that pocketed, right, that savoring this experience so tangibly, is the greatest gift one can ever have. Whilst at the very same time, it's the greatest pain. All the pain in the world comes from that as well. So you can see how it mirrored here in both ways, the big picture and that what every human being can relate as well.
Yeah. So it's through sacrificing yourself, right? If you surrender to the full-blown Kundalini process, you are sacrificing yourself, and probably you don't have the option, but it feels more wonderful when you're participating instead of resisting. And that self-sacrifice of the person you thought you were then opens the door to this possibility of this transfigured and beatified life, in which the personal identity as a locus of selfhood has been obliterated, and yet the aliveness that's experienced in every aspect of our humanity is greatly enhanced. Is that accurate way of describing it?
Yes, we could describe it that way, for sure. We can also see this also as a maturation of the soul, as a good friend of mine often speaks of, as Stuart Savatsky puts it. And he uses that language purposefully to communicate that to the Western audiences who are not familiar, let's say, with Indian culture per se, Indian ethos, or let alone philosophy. So this is a full arc of being human. So it requires this process, just as the growing pains of, let's say, we encounter in our teenage years when we kiss goodbye our childhood with all its miraculous, sort of dreamy, careless existence. When we are totally in the moment, and then we are thrusted into the world of, the bodily love, right, of all that, what makes us uncertain in our skin. And this is not unlike that. We should see these stages of man, phases of man as well, here reflected. It cannot be otherwise. So this, what is beautifully given the metaphysical picture in Indian culture, which is unique in a sense of how it managed to have that dialogue, that continuation, where it becomes broken down, diluted, diverse, had to be forced to be adopting another language, and reflected through all phases of life as well here. So one of these is definitely could be seen in terms of growing pains as a greater maturity. And of course, in a sense of, in my own, let's say, lived journey of being human, is reevaluation is one of the very important and indispensable parts. And this is why I felt compelled to bring this and to speak this, because I have seen all too often how that most precious, let's say, asset of who we are is being seen as, let's say, a wasteful affair in exchange of half-baked, even if half-baked, it's not even half-baked, very often some mental ideation about how one ought to live spiritual life. So for me, it feels very, very privileged and important at once to communicate this understanding.
Yeah, even the progressive spiritual communities, it's like most of them, maybe all of them, I don't know, they seem to, in some ways, whether explicitly or implicitly, marginalize or dismiss or exile certain aspects of our humanity for the sake of an ideology of, their notion of spirit or spirituality, which seems a tragedy, isn't it?
Well, yes, it's certainly derailed many people out there. Derailing now as we speak. Derailing. Some people, of course, are born with this renunciate stricken them, and no doubt some people are much more cerebral as well. Some people just. But what becomes not good is when people are thrown on the side of, being sidetracked, or let alone become a roadkill on our way to enlightenment, because it's full of those who have inadvertently somehow being maybe given the wrong perspective, which emphasized in a given moment in time that what is a phase, no doubt, inseparable, part and parcel, but not the destination. The destination is not to, because if that was the destination, the teaching sooner or later would have emphasized exiting the body as soon as possible, right?
Yes. And indeed, there are pre-tantric forms of Shaivism that taught exactly that, how to do a sadhana that culminates within, a few months or a year, with exit from the body. So that's what Tantra, arose partially in reaction to, right? And as far as I know, non-dual Tantric Shaivism is the only spiritual tradition in the world to truly not negate or exile any aspect of our humanity, and that's an extraordinary thing. So and yet there's many people who are trying to follow something they're calling tantra, right? And there's still subtle strategies of demonizing or dismissing some aspect of our lived human experience, which of course I think you agree is not to say that everything's fine just as it is, right? Because we're given these tools to skillfully work with all the aspects of our humanity to integrate them into awareness of what we fundamentally are, which is different from just saying everything's fine just like it is. Everything is included, nothing is negated, but it also needs to be integrated. Would you agree with that summary?
Oh, yes, I want to bring words of Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, or rather his response to when someone asked after one of the discourses on non-dual nature of reality of it all, kind of asked, well, Maharishi, if everything is fine, if everything as it meant to be, why are we doing all this? And Maharishi simply responds, because this is also as it meant to be.
Yeah.
And simplified it to so whenever we are faced with paradox, and this is a paradox, meant to be simply, or rather it shows there and then that this is the true thing, because paradox signals that something is not following the usual pattern of thought processes. And so,
Yeah.
and also to what you said earlier just now, for so many people, it is very important to get that understanding as soon as possible is that what is the highest aspiration of their lives? And if one is honest and truly honest, then the highest aspiration is to really be happy in this particular embodiment, find fulfillment of that. Very far few between people who have no aspirations whatsoever and they want to exit or transcend this. It's not in the nature of most human beings, and we have to be honest about this. But somehow this has been played with, tapered with, and in some cases even played with. So therefore, this division, it creates the division. It creates this divisive. It supports that divisive sense that there is somehow greater reality of spirit, and if I get to that all my problems, all my suffering is over. Whereas all this meant to be lived amidst of all, in the midst of all of that. And that's what the beauty of Tantra as well. It's unapologetically here and now. And the cherry on the cake is that what the likes of Abhinavagupta, right, brought. It's right. So it is here literally all the time. It just eludes us. And it is always here, if only we tapped into that aesthetic quality, of that rapture, of that wonder, childlike wonder. So,
yeah. The chamatkara, as you highlighted earlier. There's so much more we could discuss, and I feel like we might need another conversation. It would be interesting to get into the different aspects or phases of awakening at some point with you, that which is a whole teaching within the Trika tradition that's a lot of people aren't aware of, and I want to get your view on that. But in the interests of time, I think it's more responsible vis-a-vis the listeners to highlight something you point out in the book, which is hugely important, which is the difference between prāṇa-activation and properly awakened Kundalini. And the reason I want to highlight this is because we do have, countless people out there making claims. I had Kundalini awakening, and perhaps even thinking themselves enlightened or something like that. And so you point out how important this distinction is, where prāṇa-activation is simply the activation and perhaps also rising of the pranic, the life force energy. And that activation can be extremely intense, powerful, and look indistinguishable from a Kundalini awakening, in fact, and indeed is itself part of a genuine and authentic awakening. But you rightly, in my view, you say the difference is that prāṇa-activation is a powerful experience, perhaps even earth-shaking experience. But in true Kundalini awakening, there is a total remaking of the individual from the ground up, the dissolution of the former self, not an enhancement, not a subtle polish or upgrade, but a fundamental reconstitution, the end of who one took oneself to be. All faculties are altered. One's sense of subjectivity and world is irrevocably changed. Beautifully stated. And I think crucially important, because when what's really happened is just the prāṇa-activation, then it becomes incorporated into people's spiritual ego. Whereas if it's the true Kundalini awakening, that aspect of ego, right, that self-conceit is utterly obliterated in the process. And so, I think, you go on to say, the true criterion is unmistakable. After Kundalini has completed her ascent and descent, the being is not the same. The process may unfold gradually or suddenly, but once Kundalini awakens in full, she does not return the same way. And so, yeah, I don't know if you want to add anything to that, but I just wanted to read a little bit of that out, this important section from page 99 to 101, because hopefully it will serve as a corrective to this rampant misunderstanding where virtually any extreme energetic experience or life upheaval is attributed to Kundalini, and we want to honor her fully and not cheapen her with that misattribution.
You have probably heard about this kind of new fashionable programs where one can become Kundalini awakening facilitator in just 3-4 days.
Yes.
CAP.
Yes.
KAP.
Yes.
Kundalini activation program.
Yes. It's
Some of my students brought this to my awareness as far back as when it rose, maybe 5 years ago, 5-6 years ago or so. And I recently suggested we should call it PAP, prāṇa-activation program.
Yes, but the problem is it might even be worse than that. Sometimes what's happening is pranic derangement.
Yes, exactly.
And the results are not pretty.
No, and also this. Well, maybe I'll leave the Reiki now out because this also been observed and documented when the Reiki methodology was introduced, and now it's many years ago. But to that importance of that distinction, as you rightly pointed out, which now becomes almost, people speak about it as going on, I don't know, on a vacation and coming back with a trophy or with some souvenir, literally becomes ridiculous. The distinction here also is that in the case of pranatana, the main, let's say, benefits of pranatana, because we shouldn't diminish the importance of that, is that it's a grand healing. It's really can be extraordinarily healing for a variety of alignments, and it definitely enhances individual capacities in many ways. But it falls short if we are to give it a clinical analysis of Kundalini proper process, because it does not accompany the process of unplugging or rewiring. So in other words, synaptic connections are not unplugged in pranatana. They remain intact. And that's what here keeps in check the notion of an individual, because our notion of an individual is inseparable here from the bioelectric activity which is formed in the years when we get that sense of who we are in the parameters of this biology and psychology. So this is literally a very subtle, very nuanced and subtle process of self-imposed boundaries, we could say, that is part and parcel of growing up, even physically, and then more so psychologically, where these boundaries are acting both as a buffer zone to protect ourselves from, let's say, being thrown to and fro. So that these boundaries create the possibility for a certain sense of our direction in life, and what we stand for, who we are. So it's necessary, absolutely, for functioning in any way, in any society. And Kundalini, of course, disrupts this greatly. And this is what makes Kundalini unapologetically different, much more volatile, but at the very same time, incomparable in a sense of what it comprised of as a whole process. Because it's only through the unplugging and rewiring that the sense of total loss of the temporal parameters fall away. And this falling away of these parameters, of course, is experienced as that a very uneasy, eerie sense of free fall, no longer knowing what one is, where one is, all this framework of what otherwise carefully constructed sense of self is constantly propagated, at least in a given phase, is given a shudder. And of course, Pranatana falls short of that. It doesn't, let's say, if you are to use that, assault the sense of self. So therefore, it always feels as an enhancement. And that's why all the dialogues, sharing, all the social media buzz is that, okay, my Kundalini, and now I'm so and so. Like before that, I was already quite something. Or like now I'm like, so this, of course, is a it's a very hopefully, and it's interesting because what I find is that people who have that sense of sincerity, for them it was a great relief to know that this wasn't a real Kundalini. It answers the questions. For example, why have I gone through all this shaking and movements and this and that, right? Mudras, phase, but I don't feel enlightened. If I'm honest, I'm not feeling like, I don't even know if I had major breakthroughs. So in a way, this explains, and so humbly people feel grateful that this understanding allows this, let's say, other than living in a limbo. What was it like? If this was Kundalini, why am I not remade? But those in whom the sincerity is lacking, of course, they deny this and like, no, mine is Kundalini, full stop. I know it's Kundalini because of whatever reasons.
Yeah. And I mean, insofar as at the deepest level, Kundalini is the innate intelligence in all life energy and unfolds, the entire world of our experience. But what they're talking about, right, is that aspect of Kundalini that is liberating, is awakening and liberating, and that's what they're claiming. And it's problematic for so many reasons, right? Because there's a missed opportunity to see, what I did is I had this experience and I formed a concept out of the experience, and I grabbed onto the concept and made it part of my identity. And now I don't want that to be challenged. But that is already the evidence that it wasn't true Kundalini awakening, because there's the self-identity trying to defend itself and justify itself.
And it's at the expense of reinforcing itself. It has to reinforce, it reinforces that. So deep down, it's like no one is fooled here. One just fools oneself, simply. Yeah. It's impossible to, so this is why, in my experience, it's also interesting to see how those in whom that sincere quest, it comes as a source of solace and understanding and explanation, and it gives them this, okay, yes, it's humbling, and at the very same time, okay, so no need for confusion.
Yeah.
And so the propensity here, of course, and we're not even speaking about how all this is linked to other aspects. People get confused by exposure to so many different systems that are totally balloony and like imagined out of thin air, like Kundalini yoga and all that kind of brands that just same like that KAP. It just creates more confusion among sincere people.
Yeah.
And that's a big problem in itself, in its own
Yeah.
way.
And just to circle back briefly, and maybe we can close with this question of earlier you said that in Tantric Shaivism, individuality is preserved or doesn't need to be negated, and that's true in a way and not true in a way, depending on how one interprets the word individuality. And so this is my concern, is that if somebody says, oh, Tantric Shaivism teaches the ego doesn't need to be annihilated or individuality is not negated, the very probable misunderstanding that arises is, oh, I get to keep my identity. I get to keep my self-conceit. And that's not true at all, right? So individuality in the sense of your self-concept gets completely obliterated in this process. But if by individuality we mean just our humanity, right? Our beautiful, adorable human quirks and foibles and eccentricities and perfections, yes, that is not relinquished in the authentic process, but everything you thought you were, which is, a big part of the clinging is on to who you thought you were going to be and what kind of person you are and what your story is, and all of that, if it's not offered up willingly, is wrenched away with absolute ruthlessness by goddess Kundalini. And so there's no place in the teaching where you're going to get to keep your identity. And so I just wanted to mention that, assuming you agree, so that people don't get the wrong idea when it comes to this word individuality.
The best way to reflect on this is that individuality as a sense, as an experience itself, is a gift of Kundalini. The Kundalini itself is what gives the experience of individuality. And it is the Kundalini, that very same power, is that goes through self-transfiguration. So in other words, there is no room left to squeeze myself in. And with that understanding, which of course it's the sharpest, also the most, I would say, empowering in a good sense, because it gives one courage to go through the phases of what otherwise could result in depersonalization, is very important. Because also here, we're not just speaking about it in, let's say, purely esoteric sense, unrelated to how it is being experienced by our human family. Many people, when they go through these processes, they get derailed to such degree, and so very often wanting to have that annihilation, right? And believing that through the annihilation of the ego, that the true freedom is tasted. But here, it's very important in my work always to keep that distinction. And that's why I have to bring this into the context of our immersions. The creme de la creme of Tantric teaching, Tantric Shaivism, is the meaning of Aham, the supreme mantra. So, in other words, at all times, we are that. And there's only one I. So, therefore, as the open vowel, ha as the means and the power, and that resonance that is left, that reverberating of that mantra, are altogether comprising here the experiencer, experiencing, and experienced. So this is the way to work, even at the very, very onset, get going, to understand this. So that therefore one doesn't fight or doesn't lock horns with one's own ego, because that battle cannot be won. Why? Because of what was suggested here, that the sense of individuality is in itself the coiled state of Kundalini, when it falls back onto itself now in that state where it curved onto that what gives rise to this uniqueness of individual experience. And we cannot extricate and separate that. We cannot separate that even if we try. So this is why the beauty of the teaching here is that, spoken of so often, the last step equals to the first step. The first step and the last step absolutely equal. Understanding need to be right from the get-going, the right understanding. And that is rooted in the understanding of aham. So universal egoity, that, right, the supreme subjectivity, need to be understood for what it is. And those who are ready to understand that, they will not fall prey to self-aggrandizement, because if properly understood, it's utterly and entirely and always humbling.
Yes.
In fact, how could that even be? How could that even be? How could that even be? You see, it's a humble realization, admonition of that what the mantra represents here in its full essence. Those who are not ready, of course, we could say, well, that's Shiva still prefer to pretend.
Yeah.
Right? So
beautifully said. You probably know also the analysis of a hum in the tradition. I mean, it can be analyzed in multiple ways, right? But one of the main ones is is Shiva, ha is Shakti, and then the is nada. So you get, that's the whole.
yes.
So for there to be an embodied embodied consciousness experiencing I-ness, it's all three in one. It's Shiva, Shakti, nada. And you need nada, or else it's not a hum.
Yeah, otherwise it's not a hum. It's I-ness complete. So that of course is the first step, and it is the last step. And so that those who, for example, gone through all the phases, those rare few who have gone through this and experienced that, and they need just this last confirmation, and then this teaching comes, and for them it's like the tears of relief, tears of gratitude, because this teaching, even though gets now more popularized, and there is more of that, of course, still hasn't been out that much, that long. And some people, have been exposed to other teachings, the teachings which is based on negation, and they're still kind of waiting for, like, when this wretched sense of myself would go. When would it go? The answer, it cannot go. It's an integral part. An integral dance, the integral part, it cannot go. So what goes here is not that. What goes is a rigid structure where everything revolves around that, what here represents here, that objective field of experience. So in that objective field of experience is that what literally consciousness bounces off. Or we can now freely maybe expand this and just give also a voice so as not to sound too exclusive. In the Brahma Sutras, one of the principal texts on Advaita Vedanta, it states clearly, Brahman is realized through avidya. So the realization of Brahman is through avidya. Why? Well, let's ponder on that why. How can Brahman realize in any other way other than through ignorance? Because it realizes that ignorance is unreal. And realization of Brahman then shines forth for what it is. So hence one of the sutras states simply that it is through avidya the Brahman is tasted, Brahman is realized. It's not realized through Brahman. Why would Brahman need to realize Brahman? Is if it remains Brahman. So this, in the language of the Shaivites, I don't like that sound simply. I don't like that hide and seek, because it, of course, it's more than hide and seek. But for the simplicity, if we are to break it down, it a kind of has that quality that is deliberately hide itself in creation, in manifestation, for the sake of the thrill of its revelation, of its recognition.
Yeah, concealment and revelation. And earlier you invoked the myth of the dismemberment of Prajapati, and the exact antonym of dismember is remember.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
And there's something more. There's a subtle nuance we could bring that takes that teaching deeper, but I don't think we have time for that. And I did just want to mention that whatever you, at least when it comes to Tantric Shaivism, whatever you say about it, you always find then a teaching that contradicts what you thought was an absolute principle. And so in the Trika, you've got the Shiva Shakti Nada and the how consciousness is not and couldn't be complete without embodiment and without recognition of itself within embodiment. All of that is true. And yet also when you get the analysis of the 12 Kalis, which is of course an absolutely crucial doctrine of the Krama, which for those who are using the phrase Kashmir Shaivism, well, the Krama is just as much a part of Kashmir Shaivism as the Trika is. And so we've got the 12 Kalis, and the 11th Kali is specifically the movement beyond individuality, the moment when individuality is utterly reabsorbed, not just personal individuality, but even any sense of self at all. The trans-individual self too is utterly reabsorbed, and Abhinavagupta makes that clear in his analysis of the 12 Kalis. So whether that is pictured as something that can happen within a human lifetime or only at the time of death, I have no idea. But I'm just mentioning, every time it's clear what the teaching is, then you find a nuance somewhere that says, oh, but also individuality can be fully retracted. So I don't know what you think about that, but I just thought I'd mention it. And I think it would be very interesting if you and I were to go through the 12 Kalis in detail together, because that is fascinating.
Absolutely would love it. You may also like to know that the summer immersion at one of our regular places we go back to now since 2007 in Germany, northern Germany, Good Sandstorf, the place of stillness, which is a modern monastery, non-religious. It's a spiritual community run by C. Parkin, where I am going to attempt at introducing the basic tenets of Krama. So I would love us to, and I know, and I've heard that you're working on a book right now.
Yes.
As your next project. So I'm finding that quite serendipitous in the sense of how this hidden germ is remained kind of like eclipsed almost by much more exposed Pratyabhijñā and Spanda equally.
Yeah.
And but I just wanted to, yes, so first I would very much welcome that and would like that for us to at some point to sit down and talk to. But what you also yes, when you were mentioning the Abhinavagupta, right, and precise description of the 12 kalis in relation particularly to the experience of time and presence, which I spoke in the book only in the concluding reflection. When I'm not concluding, the additional parts added literally the last 2 months of just before we submitted the manuscript, these 2 reflections at the very end of the book. There is also experience that I went through, which alluded by Abhinavagupta, that there is a state which is touched in a living body, where if one to remain there longer than Abhinavagupta gives exact minutes, and there are some sources that you might be able to trace to give a more precise, because in some sources I came across 12 minutes. In some other sources, it's much less than that, only 4 or 5 minutes. If yogi is to remain longer in that state, his body literally will be pulverized. Like it will not be able to withstand that what is being experienced. And in the earlier part of our exchanges in this conversation, when you asked me to draw this arc of that process, when I was back in London and upon this experience of what I had in still Uzbekistan, which gave me this courage to go through, there was this distinctive phase which I personally mark as an understanding of complete full rising, which took place 3 days in a row, culminating in that what I attempted to speak on 2 occasions in some of my interviews many years ago, when I woke up. In fact, it wasn't even a sitting. In the middle of the night, I had this, suddenly my body sprang up, which was quite common. And the tumultuously loud sound of a stream of inverted kind literally was like a roaring sound of a thunderous kind of nature. Took all this, everything inside, outside, fused it. And I have first witnessed this as a light that was pouring outside, out of myself. First as I was drawn to that light, and once I merged into that light, there was this distinctive experience as if the light itself coming out of my own being. And this is very difficult to put it into the language. But what I felt is that this, if I were to stay there a little longer, that would be distinctively and utterly decomposition of me into like primal elements. It was not even a cellular experience. It was experience as if I was at the subatomic level. And when all that waned, there was this profound sound of that flute. Profound sound remained for several days with me. And I had to, I went out that very same night, I went out as if following this kind of almost this enchanted state to look for the source of that sound, even though I knew the sound is coming from deep within. But when I read about that, that experience that Abhinavagupta relates to will be lived in the yogi's memory as this utter and entire confirmation of immortality. So now, no matter what happens to this person, the resonance that is left after that experience is there, always remains, and I can subscribe to that utterly and entirely. But at the very same time, this kind of complete and utter unification is, because you did say whether this is possible in a human body, and that's what brought me this as a reminder, that Abhinavagupta marked that this cannot, even in the tradition gives, that only can be experienced for a duration of time and no more, because that would be complete and utter at the expense of the dropping the body.
And in which writing of Abhinavagupta did you find this passage?
It's in the Marduchkovsky's Tantra Loka, which I have here, for which I have to confess is a monumental task to still yet to fully, but some of the readings that I had to do, so to enrich the book, because the passages in the book that in the Kundalini are coming from Duchkovsky's translation of the Tantra Loka, which are otherwise are not available yet. There are no sources yet available of a particular, let's say, like I'm sure you will enjoy greatly the part on giving the, well, maybe not necessarily that part, because this is also something we can speak on dedicated occasion, is the 13-fold movements.
Oh yes, no, I did. I looked at that. The
Shakti-Vijnana, yes.
Chakra-Vijñāna. That's very interesting, and I'm glad you're bringing some attention to that little-known text, which, yeah, seems quite important. And we could return to that another time as well. I just want to mention your song of a new goddess at the end of the book is just, it's just beautiful, you know, exquisitely evocative. And you know, some people, I'm afraid some people will try to read your book and think they need to understand everything, and they'll get stuck somewhere halfway or in the middle or something. And so I think you agree that the reader doesn't need to understand everything intellectually. If they were to just keep going, they're going to get everything they need, and maybe what they need is at the end, right? So it would be a pity if they let themselves get stuck by the belief, the false belief that they need to understand everything. Would you agree with that?
Oh, I take it as the greatest, I would say, insight into the real, I cannot say purpose, because the book is not coming out of the purpose. The book is an organic kind of a rising within itself, even in terms of how it took shape. But once this manuscript was ready, when I was reading it back, and I had to take some distance, because crafting it, as you know, as a writer, is a different thing from, let's say, bringing concepts and turning into the language, bringing the necessary angle. What I suddenly felt, and it then became almost the necessity to rewrite the book, and it was a 1 year delay just for that, because I've realized this book needs to be utterly and entirely rewritten in view of it's not trying to just say things so that it makes sense, but rather create this resonance in the reader. And that resonance in itself is more important than, let's say, grasping something and, oh, I got it now. So I'm very, very, again, humbled. I'm humbled many times in this discussion. Harish, it's a truly humbling experience to have this, especially you reading back the passages. But that is not at all about understanding and coming out with some kind of goods and clenched in one's fist of understanding, but simply being exposed to that what one's lived reality is, effectively speaking. This was my humble, let's say, intent. And of course, we can only hope it can do what, for those who will find in themselves, right? It's I distinctively also it's a balancing act. I didn't want to overburden the book with my own experiences. There are quite few spiritual autobiographies out there, right, that I've read and I'm aware of, and I wanted to make sure that I don't do that. This is not the kind of the book. So they're precisely introduced and also measured. In fact, I spoke much more today because of your encouragement and invitation than I allowed for it to make the part of the book.
Yeah. Well, thank you for saying that. And listeners, I'll just give you that really clear encouragement. It was just confirmed by the author. If you don't understand something, if you get stuck, just keep going with this book, because with something like this, there's a transmission that's possible, and trying to parse the meaning of all of the words is what can get in the way of that transmission. So thank you for creating this, and these conversations need to continue. Even though we talked longer than I have with any podcast guest, in a way, we've only scratched the surface. There's so much nuance that could be explored. But I absolutely appreciate what you've shared and what you're offering to the world. And I'm just delighted to experience your humility, your clarity and focus and dedication to service, balanced by humility. And it's wonderful to meet a kindred spirit on this journey.
Well, as the Brits say, that joy is all mine and delight is all mine. I'm glad that we finally met, even in this format. We nearly met in Dubai.
Yes.
Nearly. And so,
Yeah.
yes.
Well, to be continued. Do you have any final thing you want to say to the listeners, or can we just say to be continued?
I think to be continued. Really, we've covered so much that I don't want to dilute it now with any final things.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Vamadeva.
Thank you, Harish. Thank you.
Hope you enjoyed the episode. Remember, you can always find out more about the tradition of non-dual Shaiva Tantra at tantrailluminated.org, where, if you wish, you can become a subscriber to our online learning portal, and you'll receive access to a vast number of recordings, including a comprehensive curriculum in tantric philosophy, tantric yoga practices, guided meditations, and much more. Music for the podcast composed and recorded by Ann Leader. Find her at annleader.com. Podcast produced by Paula Chamas. New episodes drop every other week. And may all beings benefit.